So let's talk about building a world-class nation literally from scratch. I mean, not just from nothing, but from a foundation of muddy, swampy land with zero resources, a place that everyone, including its own leaders, was pretty sure was doomed to fail. That, right there, is the almost unbelievable story of Singapore, a nation that somehow went from a third world crisis to a first world powerhouse in just one generation. And look, these weren't the words of some random pessimistic guy on the street. This was the raw, genuine fear of Singapore's own founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, on the very day his country was born. And you know what? He wasn't being dramatic. He was just being realistic. So that's the big question we're going to tackle in this explainer. How does a place that was literally kicked out of its own country, with absolutely nothing to its name, end up with its average citizen being wealthier than the average American? How on earth do you turn certain death into such an incredible success story? All right, let's peel back the layers of this miracle, and we're going to start right at the very bottom. Okay, so to really get your head around the scale of this achievement, you first have to understand just how bad things were. We are talking about the mud part of our mud to marble story. The foundation wasn't just weak, it was pretty much non-existent. Just look at this list. The situation in 1965 was an absolute perfect storm of crises. One day, Singapore is part of Malaysia. The next, it's kicked out, cast adrift, involuntarily independent. It had no oil, no minerals. Heck, it didn't even have enough drinking water for its 2 million people. It was this tiny island, smaller than New York City, surrounded by neighbors who were not exactly friendly. On top of that, you have massive unemployment, deep, simmering racial tensions, and absolutely no army to protect itself. It was basically every possible national crisis, all happening at the exact same time. So, how on earth did they end up in this mess? Well, the journey to this moment of crisis was actually pretty short and really turbulent. Let's do a super quick rewind and see how Singapore got backed into this impossible corner. For more than a century, it was a successful British trading post, perfectly located on global shipping routes, but then, boom, 1942. The myth of British invincibility gets completely shattered when their so-called impenetrable fortress falls to the Japanese in less than a week. Can you believe that? So after the war, the solution for this tiny island seemed obvious. In 1963, they merged with their big neighbor to form Malaysia. But that union was a total disaster, filled with political infighting and racial conflict. And just 2 years later, Singapore was unceremoniously kicked out, left completely and utterly on its own. Okay, so the situation seems completely hopeless, right? But in the middle of all this chaos, Lee Kuan Yew saw one and only one advantage, and he decided to bet the entire country's future on it. This was the blueprint, the plan for turning that muddy base into polished marble. Now, what's really wild about this strategy is just how radical it was at the time. You have to remember, in the 1960s, most new nations were all about self-sufficiency. They were putting up trade barriers. Lee Kuan Yew, ever the pragmatist, knew Singapore had nothing to be self-sufficient with. He basically said, "That's a stupid idea for us." So they did the exact opposite. They decided to become the most open, the most efficient, the most indispensable hub for global trade and finance, basically a toll booth on the world's busiest highway. So it's one thing to have a great idea on paper, right? But it's another thing entirely to make it happen when your country is literally falling apart. So how'd they pull it off? Well, they started tackling their biggest threats with a series of really ingenious solutions, one by one. First things first, the most immediate threat: water. Singapore was totally dependent on Malaysia, who could just turn off the tap at any moment. So the solution was this massive engineering project. They turned huge chunks of the island into water catchment areas, and, this is the critical part, they invested in technology that was basically science fiction back then, turning salt water from the ocean into fresh, drinking water on a massive scale. All right, next up, the economy. With no natural resources, Lee Kuan Yew famously declared that Singapore's only resource was its people and its wits. So they set out to create the world's most business-friendly environment. Zero tolerance for corruption, super low taxes, and a government that just worked. They rolled out the red carpet for foreign companies, making Singapore the perfect, stable place for anyone who wanted to do business in Asia. At the time, most Singaporeans were living in these crowded, really dangerous slums. So the government launched this radical public housing program. But here's the genius move. They also created a forced savings plan for every single worker. And then they let people use those savings to buy their government-built apartment. So you see, this didn't just solve a housing crisis. It gave every single citizen a tangible asset. It gave them a real stake in the country's success. And the success of that policy
Well, it's just staggering. Over 80% of Singaporeans today live in public housing that they themselves own. I mean, that is a level of home ownership and social stability that's almost unimaginable in most other developed nations.
Finally, they had to invest in their people. They made English the language of business to connect to the rest of the world, while also making sure students learned their mother tongue. And to solve that no army problem, they started mandatory military service. And a strategy behind it was so cunning. They called it the poisonous swallow. The idea was, look, we're too small to threaten anyone, but we're going to make ourselves so well defended that it would be agonizing for any aggressor to even try to attack us. Okay, so all of this sounds pretty amazing. Double-digit economic growth, high homeownership, stability, sounds great. But this incredible progress, the polish on the marble, it came at a pretty significant cost, especially when it came to individual freedoms. This slide really lays out the fundamental trade-off, the deal at the heart of the Singapore model. On the one hand, you get a society with incredibly low crime, sparkling clean streets, and real social harmony. But the price you pay for that is a government that enforces really strict laws, yep, including that infamous ban on chewing gum, controls the media, and puts some serious limits on political opposition and free speech. And this, right here, was Lee Kuan Yew's justification, just laid out plain and simple. He basically argued that for a fragile, multi-ethnic nation on the brink of total collapse, Western-style liberal democracy was a luxury it just couldn't afford. His focus was on one thing: delivering results, stability, and economic well-being, which he believed the people valued more than anything else. So, after all of that, after decades of this really unique top-down approach, what's the end result? What is the finished product, the Singapore of today? Just take a look at this chart. In a single generation, Singapore went from being a developing nation to one of the richest on the entire planet. Its GDP per capita, which is a key measure of wealth, eventually surpassed that of Great Britain, its former colonial ruler. I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. The transformation was total, and it was undeniable. So yeah, today, Singapore is that gleaming global hub, exactly as they envisioned. But its success has created a whole new set of complex first-world problems. The population is aging really quickly, the cost of living is extremely high, and that old model of tight social control, it's a lot harder to maintain in the age of the internet. And that brings us to our final big question. The Singaporean miracle was engineered through brilliant policies for sure, but also by the uncompromising will of its founding generation. Now that they're gone, can this unique model, this precious marble figure, continue to stand on its own? Well, only time will tell.